a collaboration between the independent publisher McSweeney's in San Francisco and KCRW in Los Angeles. They're one of the two main public radio stations in serving Southern California. This is what I want to do for the half hour that we have here is give you some thoughts about experimental radio that I researched for the Third Coast Festival, which was a couple of weeks ago now in Chicago, which I haven't been to this conference much yet because of the tiny gentleman sitting in the second row. But so I don't know how much people have been shouting out to the Third Coast Festival here. So allow me to shout out to it. It is mandatory for anybody interested in creative audio, podcasting, radio making in this country. Buy my lights. So, have fun here, then buy tickets for next year at Third Coast. I did the talk at Third Coast with another producer named Michelle. We tried to cover like the entirety of experimental radio in the English language, roughly centering on documentary work, which was bonkers. We didn't have enough time to do it all there, and that was like 90 minutes. I don't even know what I'm going to be able to cover here. Also, Michelle not being here means Canada and Australia have been destroyed. So I also want to say I'm legally blind, which means I have no peripheral vision, but because time is going to run out almost certainly, won't you do a thing that sometimes happens in my life? Will you knock if you want to just interrupt me? Because I'll miss your hand. I'll leave you hanging for days. But just knock and jump in, because I would like, I have a feeling I might just have had too much coffee and too little sleep and miss all of the Q&A section. I'm not planning on missing the Q&A session, but just knock and then we'll talk midstream if that works for you. I realize people always say that and then it never happens, but that's my shot at it. So a little bit about me just before we dive into this, because it informs sort of my selection. I'm skipping that. I'm going to be doing that a lot because how much time would we really have? I also think I might skip Europe. Let's just focus on the United States. But I just want to, I'm not doing that either. Man, I didn't think this through, you guys. Let's just cancel it. Class dismissed. Just kidding. I teach at UMass in the journalism department, but I'm a weirdo and don't think of myself as a journalist. The Believer, if I had slides, I could show you a picture of it. It's an arts and culture magazine, and my background is as a magazine editor. And KCRW wanted to collaborate with McSweeney's, and The Organist is sort of the result. So I'm going to play you just like 30 seconds of the first episode of The Organist to give you a taste of it.
Podcast. Out of the billions of thermal tubes inside your computer, through some necessary wires and pipes, into your kitchens and living rooms and cars and office spaces and halfway houses. A veriform bouquet of content delivered with precision and love to you. It's magic. That's the only way to look at it. Magic, except it's not magic at all. A podcast is every bit as explainable as your toaster.
So The Believer covers a lot of experimental art. We cover, it's arts journalism. We write about the avant-garde, but I remember when we first made The Organist as a podcast with very little audio experience, we thought, we don't want to sound anything like This American Life. We don't want to sound anything like this was about six years ago or so now. So podcasting hadn't quite become the thing that it is now before us. And I remember we made this first episode, and my boss, Dave Eggers, who's the sort of creative director of McSweeney's and by extension The Organist, we played him this pilot episode, and he just said, this sounds like 3 a.m. college radio, stoner, dorm room nonsense, like you can't do this. And I was like, no, but we're experimental, right? Like The Believer's experimental. And he had to remind me that this magazine that I'd worked for almost a decade, actually, he said all the headlines say what the articles are about, and all the words in the articles are in the right order, and they make arguments that you understand from reading the first paragraph. And I had to kind of dial back my sense of what I thought experimental meant. And so I mention all this by way of self-introduction, but also to just say that we could have there could be a talk purely on sound art, radio art, that is just like radically, aggressively uninterested in audience pleasure. That's not what this is. So this is sort of my very narrow and personal idea about not just what is experimental radio, but I think one of the things about experimentation is it's how the conventions are formed, right? There are conventions in any medium, and then people push back against them by making experimental work, and then that shifts the parameters or the way that we think of a medium, and then the process begins again. So to start, thinking about the U.S., I actually wanted to start in Italy with the futurist F.T. Marinetti, who has a really problematic history, later went on to, I think, found the Italian Fascist Party. We're not going to go there. He also was a, crucial figure in the European avant-garde and modernism, and as the founder of the futurist group. And this is a piece, so he went to, probably should look at my notes, the Balkan War of 1912, and he was actually covering this war as a journalist for a French newspaper, and was in what's now Turkey, in Adrianople, the siege of Adrianople in 1912, and he produced this document, this text called Zang Tum Tum, and this is a recording of, I believe, him reading it, although feel free to get me in trouble if it's not actually it, but I think it is.
Studi, ombria, brezza verde, silenzio. Chip, 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 chip. Gran. I pazzi bastoni professori d'orchestra, questi bastronatissimi suonare, grandi fragori, non cancellare, anzi precisare minutissimi ottavi di echi dell'ampiezza del teatro di guerra a 500 chilometri quadrati. Fiumi illustri, Tungia, Marizza, sdraiati.
So even if you don't speak Italian, which I don't, you'll hear that there's a lot of nonsense words in there. It's a lot of onomatopoeia. And so this is this sort of, there's this great collection, if you are interested in radio art and experimental audio, called The Wireless Imagination, which is a phrase from Marinetti, edited by Douglas Kahn, who's, I think, the leading scholar of sort of the possibilities of radio as art, and Gregory Whitehead, who's, I think, one of the leading practitioners, or was in his day. That's rude. This is being recorded. I love Gregory Whitehead. But they write about this as a sort of phonographic war reporting. And I really am interested in, as I was listening to sort of radio history to research this, there's a thread of war and this sort of the ways of how the voice in extremists comes through in radio history. And I think that's an important part of this idea of experimental radio is not, we think of podcasting maybe as these as modulated voices, as authoritative voices, but here at the beginning of the ability to record sound and engage and document not just the world, but human reaction to the world, we have this sort of overflow of language. And I don't have a clip of it, but there's the famous recording of the Hindenburg Disaster, which was one of the first, it wasn't broadcast live, but he had a lacquer, it was the early technology of the lacquer cylinder that was being recorded, Herbert Morrison, and then he's sort of narrating this very gentle, mellow, live kind of stand-up, what we think of as like the stand-up reporter, and then of course the Hindenburg explodes and he completely loses it on lacquer. And that's the famous, oh, the humanity! And so it's sort of interesting to think of that in connection to this Zang Tum Tum. But then as we kind of push forward into radio history, Susan Douglas, the radio historian, has a great phrase in her book, Listening In, the invention of broadcast journalism, which is, among others, Edward R. Murrow.
I'll just let you listen to the traffic and the sound of the siren for a moment. Just a few people here walking rather hurriedly toward the air raid shelters. Some of them casually. A man stops in front of me to light a cigarette. Here comes one of those big red buses around the corner. Double-deckers they are, just a few lights on the top deck. In this blackness, it looks very much like a ship that's passing in the night, and you just see the portholes.
So this is not what you might expect to be thinking about experimental radio, but I think that there's a lot here in terms of what I mentioned at the beginning about conventions being formed, and this is new at the time. I had slides with the dates. I can send them to you later. It's 1940. That's he went up to the rooftop in London during the London Blitz. Maybe he's iconic, and that was it broadcast live? Yeah. And even that gesture, if you can call it that, of running the wires up from the studio to the rooftop is a sort of like, you know, it's a technological experiment. And also I think here is the beginning of this sense that I think we receive and take for granted maybe of the authoritative, you know, stern, not basso profundo, but, you know, the deep-voiced newsman. Murrow sort of helps establish this. But also you hear the actualities in the background, right? The sound of the air raid sirens. And there's a section in these recordings where he says, you know, like, now let's just hear the footsteps. So you can hear a man lighting a cigarette and the sense of the sounds of the world beginning to intrude on what was previously really just the voices in the studio. I am going to also not play the tape, but there was a popular program on American radio around this time called Vox Pop, which if any of you have worked in radio journalism, you know Vox Pop is, you know, you go out on the street and ask 20 people the same question and cut it together. And this was not quite that, but it was the beginning of hearing everyday voices on the radio, which was also kind of a radical idea at the time. And I'm skipping all of Europe, but around the same, actually earlier at the BBC, this is a new thing where the BBC would, you know, historically be very elite voices on the air, but then they start becoming interested in voices of the working class and talking to working class people and putting their voices on the air. And the image I love from Vox Pop is before the sort of mobile recording unit technology began to take off with magnetic tape in the 40s and 50s, similar to Murrow, they would actually dangle a mic out the studio window down to the street. So around the same time, there's these sort of twin moves, up to the rooftops, down to the street. But I want to play, the next piece of tape I want to play you is from a person who is regarded as a giant of radio drama, kind of golden age radio drama, Norman Corwin. There's a really wonderful edited volume called Anatomy of Sound, edited by Neil Verma, who is just a wonderful scholar of radio. If you're interested in radio drama at all, he has a book called Theater of the Mind that is a study of American Golden Age radio drama. That's wonderful. But so anyway, Norman Corwin is a sort of central figure and of radio drama. But then after the war, he was hired by the UN to be, what's his job title? It's like the director of special stuff. I don't think that's quite what it was. But the UN hires Norman Corwin to be director of special stuff, and there it is, radio chief of special projects. That was close. And he started making these radio documentaries that use actuality. So the tape we're about to hear has actual sound from the UN floor, but also blends all of the tools of radio drama that he used. And this is from a piece called Document A777 from 1950.
Not fiction. Nothing in this program is fiction. Tupacamaru in Bolivia, before and after him, thousands of men like him tortured in other countries, for other causes, at other times, right up through Germany, 1945, all of which document A777 takes into account.
Article 5. No one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment.
Bolivia, sí. Brazil, sí. Burma, Belarus, abstain. Canada, yes. Chile, sí. China.
Stop for China.
So I think in that you can hear the origins of something like Radiolab's More Perfect, which similarly uses actualities in reporting and blends it with all the tools of radio drama and creative use of audio with a sort of civic aim in mind of explaining something about the way that politics work or institutions operate. And Corwin also does similar stuff to radio in terms of stuff that touches on science and all that. Okay, so I'm blazing through here, but so jumping another 10 years to 1960, Studs Terkel is best known as an oral historian, and a lot of his radio work, if you listen to it, or books like Working, are very much about just the voice of his radio work. You'll hear him asking the questions, right? And it's sort of, there's nothing that formally inventive about it necessarily, but in 1961 he started listening to Norman Corwin's work, or he had been thinking about Norman Corwin's work, as well as a lot of the European feature makers. There's this whole, like the idea of a feature coming out of the BBC is this nebulous genre that means something like, I think the etymology comes from the idea of a feature film. So it's the idea of of a story that's not just a straight news report, but something that has these qualities that we're talking about, this sort of creative use of sound, a more poetic sensibility rather than a straight journalistic documentary one. So Studs Terkel is listening to a lot of this stuff, and he makes this piece called Born to Live from 1961.
And she said it was such an intense heat that she jumped into the nearby river, the small river that was running through the sea.
すると友達が顔だけ海水から顔だけ出して「お母さん助けてくれお母さん助けてくれ」と言って泣き叫んでおりました。
She said that her friends were in the river. I don't think I can say.
So what I hear in this is another way of thinking about this idea that we started with of the voice kind of at its extremes and the failure of language, but notably radio's ability to present that failure in a way that overcomes it, if that makes sense. So here we have the translator breaking down and saying, she can't translate these words, but then Terkel's presentation of it, in some ways the emotional impact of it is the same as if we had read a complete translation of transcript. And this is a style of radio making that begins to grow in the U.S. I mean, it precedes Terkel, the work of Alan Lomax and his sort of ethnographic field recordings. I don't know if that's the right term for them. You know what I'm talking about, right, Galen? The Kitchen Sisters later, beginning in the 70s and 80s, Davia Nelson and Nikki Silva kind of mastered this form, I think, of the non-narrated. So there's no narrator explaining what voices we're hearing. It's just the sound of the voice and the archival tape. I highly recommend looking up the Kitchen Sisters work if you haven't heard that. So just to keep bouncing forward in time, in the 1970s. NPR is founded in 71, and I think it's pretty widely known, but I mean I'm always continually surprised by how weird NPR was if you listen back to its early years. Like the first 20 years of NPR, it sounds nothing like the NPR that we know today. And it really comes out of the zeitgeist of the time, I think. I interviewed a guy named Keith Talbot, who was, he described his job as like the Bell Labs of NPR, and his job, like his full-time job, was to think of new ways of telling stories in sound. He hired Ira Glass as an intern, and he told me about the influence of Sgt. Pepper's on him as a radio producer, the idea namely being that before Sgt. Pepper's, pop records, rock and roll albums would have like 3 or 4 seconds between each band, between each song. Sgt. Pepper's was this sort of like early concept album where the songs flowed into each other, one to the other, with the transitions being really important. And then not just sonically, but also conceptually, like the Beatles were dressed up like this fictional band, Sgt. Pepper's, kind of presenting the world, as Talbot calls it, like in a display case. And so in his radio work, Keith Talbot would sort of do experiments like that, and would come up with fictional narrators and these fictional conceits that then would package together these nonfiction documentary pieces. I don't have any to play for you, but if you go to the Third Coast website, Ocean Hour is on there. That's a perfect example of this. But I do want to play, just sort of in keeping with the war thread here, the very first All Things Considered broadcast from 1971, which sort of coincidentally, as NPR was launching, it was the May Day protests in Washington, the Vietnam protests, and it's this highly impressionistic it's not produced by Keith Talbot, but I think you can hear some of that 70s zeitgeist here.
One, two, three Army helicopters flying surveillance over the small section of Washington's complicated highway system. A line of young people has just come across the highway. Traffic is stopped. And here come the police. 1, 2.
So, highly impressionistic, non-narrated, but not just non-narrated, the sense of like a cinema verite approach to radio, right? Where it's the technology was such that you could be so lightweight and portable and just sort of wander through a scene and stitch it together in a way that has that kind of impressionistic associative way. There's no transitions in that piece beyond the roar of helicopters or motorcycles. So jumping forward, or actually a little bit backward. So what happens with NPR is they begin in that super freaky 70s zeitgeist, making really wild work like that, but then as Talbot called it, like there's the rest of it, like that's like the last 7 minutes of every broadcast of ATC, but then the rest of it is guys from the Brookings Institution, as he put it. But then that kind of balance continues to tip even further over the years, and the process that producer after producer from that era described to me was that basically the more success NPR got as a mainstream news organization, the more like real stories they broke, the less room there was for this kind of work. And also, of course, there are budgetary considerations too. In '83, NPR had its first major budget crisis and laid off Talbot and basically every other person who was sort of one of the sound-forward weirdos there, and it became much more like people who were mostly just interested in breaking news. And I think you can look at milestones like the end of the Cold War, the first Gulf War, and 9/11 as these producers described them as these sort of watershed moments where NPR kind of sloughs off any residual interest in this sort of work. But meanwhile, there's another tradition I just want to point to as sort of trying to draw these genealogies through U.S. radio, which is WBAI, which is a Pacifica station still around in New York City, and there was this tradition of producers, mostly white dudes, Gene Shepard and Bob Fass and Joe Frank, where all three had shows on WBAI in the 70s, and Joe Frank unaccountably was host of Weekend All Things Considered at NPR in the late 70s. And if you wonder why I say unaccountably, here's just a piece of his from later on in his career, but it's all of them the same.
Now, many people condemn me for rocketing the cities of our enemy. But why not kill citizens? Are they less guilty than soldiers? Citizens must be held accountable for the actions of their government. Why shouldn't they die? Do they deserve to live more than the young men on the front? Is it not morally offensive that civilians should go about the business of their daily lives while soldiers die on the field of battle?
So this is an especially dark clip, but Joe Frank's work is extremely funny and extremely dark, and I think of him as, like, if we think about that authoritative voice of Edward R. Murrow, establishing broadcast journalism, Joe Frank and also the other producers, Bob Fass and Gene Shepard, they're sort of like the hip surrealist offspring of the Edward R. Murrow voice. And I think are really influential still today. I think if you listen to, after Keith Talbot hires Ira Glass as an intern, then his first actual job he gets at NPR is as Joe Frank's production assistant. And Ira Glass has written about how that experience of sort of listening to Joe narrate his work was the sort of beginning of Ira Glass's sense of radio as a potential medium for this sort of artistic expression, and not just info delivery service, to deliver the news, but actually a creative space that Gregory Whitehead and so many others have explored. And and speaking of that impulse, I'm also glossing over a group who kind of I think of as the sort of they sort of kept the dream alive through the 80s as NPR was sloughing off all these producers. there's a producer named Helen Thorington who had a program called New American Radio. Do you know New American Radio, Julie? Wesleyan did a great job of archiving it. If you go to somewhere.org, almost, I don't know if all of it's there, but a ton of stuff is there. And like all experiments, some of them are failures, but there's some real gold nuggets in there as well. So in the couple minutes I have left, I just want to, and it looks like I maybe only have time for the United States after all. And actually now we're going away from the United States. But there's a sound artist, somebody who actually, unlike most of the folks I've talked about, mostly focuses on exhibiting work, audio work in museums and galleries, named Lawrence Abu Hamdan. He's Jordanian, now based in Lebanon. In addition to this sort of art practice, he also gets hired by places like Amnesty International and the UN to do what is called auditory forensics, where he investigates the sonic aspects of scenes of political violence. I don't know if we want to just shuttle these kids out of the room. Everything will be fine.
It's lower than that.
No, it's so quiet.
That's it.
As the prison is still in operation and access is completely denied, the only way to measure the silence of Saidnaya is through the memories of its former detainees.
My friend is now a third of what it used to be. Since I was in Saidnaya, I don't rely on it as much now. I am exposed to so much more noise these days, and I could be remembering it even louder than how it really was.
So sorry about that. I don't have the ability to turn up the volume here. But this piece is called Saidnaya, the missing 19 dB or 19 decibels. And it's about the Saidnaya prison where thousands of Syrians were tortured and murdered under Assad. And they were held in total darkness, and they weren't allowed to speak above a whisper. And Abu Hamdan interviewed 5 of the survivors and created this piece. And Abu Hamdan calls himself a private ear. And I like it. I like that phrase because it kind of brings together this sense of radio journalism and this investigation through audio that he does, but also this sense of art that he works in. And I want to end by playing a clip from a podcast from this year. This is from the New York Times. Their podcast series called Caliphate, and I think you can hear the New York Times journalist Rukmeni Kalamaki talking like a private ear, like a forensic investigator in this clip.
So on this walk that we took towards the church, it became very apparent just how close we were in proximity to the front lines.
I mean, in a way, hearing those sounds was reassuring to me because it just signaled that we were where we needed to be.
What are you doing right now?
Trying to get out some trash bags. We were about to go into the building. Finally, we got to the church, and...
Could you just tell me real quick before we walk in what sort of things you're hoping to find?
So, unlike Keith Talbot's work or Norman Corwin's work, Caliphate doesn't have the trappings of a fictional conceit at all, but Andy Mills, who's the producer with Rukmeni Kalamaki, comes from Radiolab, and I think you can hear some of that same, what Neil Verma, who I mentioned, the radio scholar, calls kaleidosonic sound. So if you think of he kind of identifies 2 main styles in radio drama. There's the intimate style where you're in a room and you hear the door open and you sort of, if you think of the single camera in the room. And then kaleidosonic, I think Radiolab, if you listen to that, is the best example of it, where, I'm talking and then we zip to 14th century France and then we zip to the moon and then, the voices of all of our narrators are all kind of being blended together, and there's this cartoon sense of being able to go anywhere. And so what I think is fascinating, and where I want to end here is I think Caliphate is brilliant in the way that it updates this Edward R. Murrow authoritative war reporting, but including these kind of very creative kaleidosonic radio techniques, and that it's also extremely self-conscious. The whole piece is about her process as a journalist and has the process of investigation, and that's the way for the listeners to understand ISIS, which is the main point of the whole podcast is basically understanding how ISIS works. But the way into that is this really self-reflexive the deconstruction of the journalistic process, and I think to my ears that's the that's what gives the work authority in the way that, you know, in the 40s, Edward R. Murrow had this sort of whatever gave his voice authority there, the gravity of his voice. Now I think it's this kind of forensic and self-conscious kaleidosonic style. So there's more I could say, but it's 2:29. If you have to leave immediately, I understand, but if you guys have any questions or comments, I would be thrilled to talk about this stuff. Oh yeah, and I won't see your hands, so just be bold, knock, or just speak. Sorry, yeah.
So you mentioned Caliphate, and the thing that stuck out to me about that show was all the mic handling noise. How Andy
consider the question of experimentalism is like, does experimentalism and the avant-garde the same thing? Because one of the hallmarks that I understand about like modernism, like actual 20th century modernism, is that kind of showing of the seams and and showing where the splices are. And so and radio is interesting because it is, you know, even though it draws from traditions like literature and theater and music that precede the 20th century, it is a new media, you know, in basic definition of what a new media is, or was anyway. So am I actually answering your question? I think that in some ways radio and that sort of modernist tendencies to show the seams and that self-consciousness maybe from the beginning, are connected.
Got enough.
Yeah.
I was curious with, like, it seems like you have a really good bird's eye view of everything, and is there anything that, with that perspective, you see people starting to move away from that was a trend in the last period that you think now we're transitioning away from, or traditions that were popular that people are avoiding now?
Yeah. I think, one thing that I was trying to suggest at the end is that voice of authority, I think, is something that people are less and less comfortable building. And I think, like, you know, even if you compare, like, NPR in the 80s and 90s, you know, I think Ira Glass wanted to get This American Life on, and then I think they rejected him because his voice didn't have that kind of authoritative sound. And now I think we think of him as a pretty authoritative voice, and there's people who sort of, I think, are trying to push past whatever conventions he's established. So, and I think we can go even further. And the section that I cut at the end here is about disability and the voice. And there's some interesting producers like Alice Wong, who has a condition where she has to use a BiPAP, like a ventilator, and she records a podcast called Disability Visibility through the ventilator, and I think it's brilliant. And you know, I think that's an authoritative voice. So I think to push further and further outside of what. I mean, I teach radio journalism at UMass in a journalism department where I'm supposed to be like, here's how to make an NPR story, and then there's the NPR handbook, it's called Sound Reporting, and there's a sentence in it where they're like, unless you have a speech impediment, or like otherwise, I don't know, I forget exactly what it says, but like, you could probably be on the radio. And I feel like striking that sentence and hearing, you know, I think it's a cliche to be like, we need more voices on the radio, but I think if you push past the cliche, it's true, and then there's specific ways that all voices can be authoritative in that way. Yeah. Yes, sir.
So what is the state of creative audio, particularly in light of podcasting, right? Because as you referenced in your talk, right, particularly looking at the kind of the public radio world, which, you know, after the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, right? Like, I mean, there was no radio drama on commercial radio. Anything experimental was not happening in commercial radio. If it was happening anywhere, it was going to be in community radio or public radio. But NPR phased that out for the most part. You know, people like Joe Frank were really the exception. They were sort of, you know, pretty individualistic. And so, you know, I know you're obviously not talking about Europe and Australia and places where those traditions did carry on. But, you know, obviously, like you're playing something like Caliphate, you see these sort of modes getting picked up again. I mean, is it, so I would assume you think it's brighter, but is podcasting really opening the door to more kind of experimental creative radio?
I think yes and no. I mean, I keep on looking at Julie Shapiro, who's sitting over there, who moved to Australia to basically work at the national broadcaster, which is mind-blowing in its was mind-blowing in its dedication to, you know, putting extremely avant-garde experimental work like during daylight hours to a national audience. And I think that podcasting like blogging before it, with a lot of the rhetoric of how the internet was going to transform the potentials of literature in its whatever rhizomatic, democratizing force. I think some of that we do see in podcasting, and Michelle, in her part of this talk, talked about these podcasts where, like, unless it's hate speech, there's podcasts that'll just, like, any audio file you upload, they'll be included. And it's this, like, wild assemblage of soundscapes and nonsense. So I do think that you can find work like that. I still think community radio and low power FM movement are where a lot of interesting work is still happening. But in terms of, so your question is sort of where is the home for this sort of work now? And I think, I don't know if this is a cop-out, but this kind of work is always, I think sometimes when people make arguments about how this work should be more mainstream and it's not, in some ways, like the experimental work is the whole point of it is that it's not mainstream, and that there's always going to be this dynamic and this cycle of, like, co-optation of experimental work and then work that pushes against it and that gets co-opted. So I think you see that dynamic now, where I think you see radical podcasts, like Michelle Macklem does a podcast called Constellations that does really interesting work. And then you see the huge influx of capital into podcasting and podcast companies that are hiring talent, but then homogenizing it and making it gross.
Just to tack something on the end of that before I be running out. But as an educator, right? You said you're in a journalism department.
Yeah.
You're there to train people to do kind of NPR stories.
Right.
That's maybe a bit of an issue here, though. And that
I'm the fly in the ointment. I'm secretly giving them weird stuff.
There's not many programs that are really training young people. I mean, they can go out there and be DIY and learn this stuff and do it. But there's not a lot of there's not much of a movement to educate people towards this kind of radio art and more experimental.
Well, I mean, I taught, like, more radio art stuff at a different university, and it was really fun, but I actually prefer students who are there sort of thinking they're going to get a job in journalism and then exposing them to weird stuff and kind of sneaking it in. Somehow that feels more effective and fun to me. So, yeah, and I know other folks who are doing the same. Anybody else? Oscar, Leland, you got anything? You're good? All right. Well, thanks, everybody. I'll stick around here for a minute if you want to talk. Appreciate your attention.